started today, I just want to thank both Carol and Kate. They're here today playing hurt. Got out of bed this morning when they wanted to stay in bed, not feeling so well, so thank you both for that service. You are the universe. How many started that book and your mind went, yeah. Pretty interesting in the whole approach that they're taking in. All of the science done basically in one chapter. I mean, you had to stay awake through that chapter to be able to see where they were going with all of these threads that were put together very quickly. But before we get started, I think it's important to understand who's writing it. Most of us know Deepak. Born in India in 1946, studied medicine there, came to the United States in the Boston area, had to then become a licensed doctor in the U.S., which he did. But one of the things that some of you may not know, he was deeply involved with Maharishi Mahesh and the Transcendental Meditation movement, and became kind of a muckety-muck in that organization. And then all of a sudden, as most spiritual organizations, there was a split. Because Maharishi felt that he was teaching some of what he had been revealed to him, and it didn't quite fit into the way Maharishi did it. So there was this big split, and they went their own way. But he was very heavily involved in that whole meditation movement, and continues to this day bringing that form of meditation to the U.S. and to the world. He just has completed his 85th book. Can you imagine? I mean, this is a man with a really, really full life. And somehow he writes 85 books. Pretty amazing in its own. But I had a couple quotes here that I think kind of set the tone for where he's coming from. Deepak argues that the evolution of species is the evolution of consciousness. We've been talking about consciousness now for weeks upon weeks upon weeks. Seeking to express itself as multiple observers, the universe experiences itself through our brain. Through our brain, the universe experiences itself. We are the eyes of the universe looking at itself. He has been quoted as saying Charles Darwin was wrong. Consciousness is the key to evolution, and we will soon prove that. So to say that he has kind of jumped in front of standard thinking in the science world, he has, and he's been greatly criticized for a lot of the things that he's bringing forward under the understanding that the basis of all of it is consciousness. And it was very interesting as he went on. He says, he likens the universe to a reality sandwich, which has three layers: the material, the quantum, and then this place, a virtual zone outside of that, outside of time and space, in a domain of God. So he has put, many folks have talked about three layers of reality, three layers of the universe, but he's talking about it here in a little bit different way. And I like the way he presents that. He said, every time you're tempted to react in the same old way, ask yourself this question: do you want to be a prisoner of the past or a pioneer of the future? And I don't know how many of you have ever listened to his DVDs or his CDs, or back in the day, his tapes. But he said, whenever you have a question, do one thing: meditate. That's the answer he goes to no matter what shows up. What does he mean by that? He means get still, get quiet, go inside. Allow yourself to listen to the divine within. We've just seen 4 avatars that have just told us the very same thing that Deepak is. But he partnered with Manus, who was a quantum physicist. an MIT grad, PhD, born in Greece. Very interesting, he was born the same year that Deepak was. He's now a professor at Chapman University in California. And he is seen as one of those quantum physicists that can have a leg in the physical science and then a leg in spirituality. So he has now written 15 books. And he says this, again, and the key that I put in this, and I wanted to put it up, is look what he says. It's all about consciousness. And if you want to understand any of it, we need to go, he calls it the philosophy dealing with consciousness. And we call it here at Unity, principles dealing with consciousness. But you're seeing not only the avatars that went back 2,600 years ago in the last 4 weeks, plus now, the latest scientists that are bringing this whole notion and this concept forward are talking the base of it all is your and my consciousness. Even understanding the universe. So a lot of this beginning 3 chapters that we read, or the preface and the overview in the first chapter, was all about how was the universe created. I don't know how many of you, but it's a question I've asked over and over again, because I never really get an answer to the how. And it seems like so many of the disciplines can go so far in trying to explain this whole phenomenon, but it never kind of completes the whole circle. Have you noticed? And you're going to find the very same thing in this latest book. So let's take a look. We know in Genesis we're told this, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God then moved, and we began to see evolution. We began to see life began to happen. The very next step to that is, and God said, let there be light, and there was. So we see from the biblical standpoint, from the scriptures and the Old Testament scriptures, this was the way it was explained in creation and how the process began. Why is it important to understand? Because as we see creation happen, it's also instructions how we can create in our own lives. One of the most powerful statements is right out of this, Genesis 1:3. For you and I to say, let there be, whatever that might be. And that became the statement that drove this creation from Scripture standpoint. But then we had this guy, Einstein. Now he was doing this about 100 years ago. And I have to wonder about the mind that says, how do I answer this very deep question? Now he calls it take a nap. I'm going to call it meditate, just like Deepak did. And scientists 100 years ago couldn't say they meditated. But he would go in this quiet place and he would begin to visualize what it was like to ride on the back of a light beam. Who does that? At 186,000 miles per second. But he had the ability in his imagination to even go there, to build that scenario in his mind and said, let me see what it would be like. And out of these meditations came the understanding of relativity. Now, truth is either absolute or it's relative. Relative means it changes. Absolute means it never changes. And so what he was looking at is the things that we look at and here on this physical material world that we call absolute, such as gravity. If I go across the river, get up on the Capitol Dome, jump off, what will be absolute for me is that I will splat on the sidewalk. Gravity will take over in this environment. But what he did through this, he began to understand that the things that we see absolute here in the material physical world are not. So he explained relativity this way. When you sit with a nice girl for 2 hours, it seems like 2 minutes. When you sit on a hot stove for 2 minutes, it feels like 2 hours. That is relativity. But when he went on to be a little bit more serious about this whole notion, is that time and space and gravity have no separate existence from matter. So in the physical realm that we live in the material world that we live in, it is absolute. But when you begin to move away from the gravitational core, in this case the Earth, everything begins to change. When you're in outer space, your watch slows down. It's not the same as you and I have here. It's relative to the distance from the gravitational pull. The same thing happens with gravity. When you move out into the space, gravity begins to bend, almost like a light beam, he said. Okay. So again, gravity and time are not absolute. They're relative to where they are to the force of the magnetic pull. So interesting that just this past week, on Mars, we have the rover who's measuring things that we've never been able to measure before. And one of the reasons Mars never evolved into Earth is because the gravitational pull on Mars, they now know, is variable. And in very short periods of time and huge magnitudes. So what happens, the atmosphere that created this biosphere that we have here on Earth, that allowed us to have this perfect place to have humans, doesn't exist in Mars, because as the gravitational pull would get much less, the atmosphere would be blown into the outer space, and it opened it up to all the radiation that is in space, and would kill anything instantly that ever tried to live on Mars. So we're seeing how important just today, in this week, of this understanding that Einstein had that these things are relative and not absolute. We'll come back to this a little bit later. But Einstein explained the big stuff. He did a really good job with the universe and the galaxies and the planets and the general relativity, which came 3 years later. He explained that it all changes based upon the distance, as I was just talking about, from the gravitational source. And when we get to the Big Bang Theory, you're going to see how that takes on a whole other element, because as we we're expanding year upon year upon year. And according to that theory, we're getting further and further away from the origin of it. And what does that mean long term? They don't know. Max Planck, around the same time, a little bit before, began with what at that time was called quantum mechanics. Now, usually the term we hear is quantum physics. And most people's eyes cross. But what quantum did was it explained really well the small stuff. And as they began to go subatomic particles, so you had Einstein going big, and you had Planck and all those folks going small into subatomic structures, they began to understand quantum field, quarks, waves, and particles, and bosons. And they were speaking another whole language, but what they were finding is what was true in the small stuff wasn't true in the big stuff. And so this division happened between, yeah, we can see what's going subatomically, but it doesn't apply to what happens when you go into space, into the rest of the universe. And no one to this day has been able to cross that bridge. They still are separate. Small stuff, the big stuff. But in quantum physics, something very interesting showed up. Now, my best explanation of the quantum field, which is invisible, you cannot see it, touch it, smell it with any of your senses, is the closest thing that I can describe to you that I get from it is it's exactly what Charles Fillmore, our co-founder, called divine substance. It was that energy, that field behind all that you and I see physically. And in this quantum field, the energy and everything moved in waves, or very wave-like. And we see that even on, with light and with sound here on Earth, in the material world, is that everything has a frequency and it moves in waves. But what they discovered, it was very important that someone can observe that field and change from wave to particle. The actual field begins to coalesce around what? Back to what Deepak talked about, consciousness. And it was called the observer effect. And that you and I, in observation of, can actually begin to see this wave change into particles, particles being the material. So we're going from the spiritual realm into the material realm, and scientifically we now know that that's possible. It was named a really funny name, I thought. Higgs boson. Higgs being the man who discovered it later on, and it took 5 decades to prove this theory. That this actually could be proved. What they thought was happening mathematically, they began to actually be able to prove it scientifically, and it took to 2012. Some of you may have seen it in Time magazine or those kind of places. They began to name this the God particle. Really, really upset the scientists. They didn't like that name at all. Because you got to understand what's going on between the science and spirituality is the difference between randomness or chance and choice. And so as this became more and more understandable, that the observer can affect the wave in the quantum wave and make it begin to coalesce into something material. How different is that from what we've learned at Unity and New Thought? That we can co-create using divine substance with our consciousness, and as we hold our consciousness, it begins to coalesce into the material. Completely and totally in line with what we now know. But it took 50 years to get here, to 2012. Then we had the string theory. Now, string theory is very much in alignment with music. And they use the whole 12 Western notes to the scale that makes symphonies in saying that the string theory is basically all energy underneath matter is like a string. And when it's plucked to a certain vibration, it begins to move, and out of that it coalesces. I saw this, I had to put it up. Said, I came up with this greatest thing, that energy and matter is all around the string theory and vibrate. And the other says, how is that important to you? He goes, I don't know. But all of these theories are true at a certain level, but they still don't close in the completion of the story of the how. But we see this phenomenon in the string theory over and over again. We see it not only in the big stuff, but we see it in the small stuff. You may have seen the M theory, which is a revision on the string theory. And the M, believe it or not, stands for magic. That's the best the scientists could come up with. It's just magic creates this, and this is what occurs. And we could explain what has occurred, but we can't explain the origin, so we'll call it the M theory or magic. And then the other theory that we have, obviously, is the Big Bang Theory, that this all explosion into the universe started 13.8 billion years ago. That's a long time. But what happened is you had these cosmic dust, and the cosmic dust is in the universe, and as they come together, they coalesce to make galaxies and planets. And it's expanding from that explosion 13.8 billion years ago. Today, as we stand, they believe right now it's in excess of 12% a year. And it's expanding in all directions. The question is, that they haven't answered, is that everything else that we've seen in the universe that comes out of a Big Bang explosion ends up at some point entering and begins to dwarf into basically a black hole. When the energy dissipates. Well, this energy's been 13.8 billion years going on. It was a big energy. But what happens is this expansion, we really don't have the answer to that. And we're still missing the piece that completes the circle and the questions. After all these centuries of the greatest human minds, and these are all considered from Einstein, Planck, the greatest minds that we had in the human field. And they've worked tirelessly to answer these questions. They have not answered two. What was there before to provide the material for? And it doesn't matter which one of these scientific theories you take. String theory, Big Bang, the general relativity. There had to be something there first to be acted upon to create this next phenomenon. They haven't answered that. And it's driving all of them crazy because they want to say it's random. And it just happened. Well, I don't have the greatest scientific mind, but all I need to do is look outside at nature, and I don't see randomness. I see order. I mean, I just talked about it earlier today. We're on our way back. We're halfway back almost to the longest day of the year. It happens every year. It's not random. It will happen on June 21. We'll have the longest day of the year. December 21, we had the shortest. It happened every year of my life. That is not random. That is order. What brings the order to all this? And when you try to use randomness and chance, I always go back when the scientists want to go to, well, it was just a great thing that happened that made Earth perfect. And I go back to what Emerson said, that God's dice are always loaded to the good. But the second question they don't answer also is, what provided the intelligence to make the Big Bang happen? What had provided the intelligence to make things start to vibrate as strings? Was it chance or was it choice? And that's the question you have to answer, because they can't answer it for us. It hasn't been answered for them. And I'm not okay with just calling it the M theory for magic. And I don't think most people are either. But that's when you dig into these chapters, that for me is what came out, is these basic two questions have not been answered. And only you and I can answer them for ourselves. Why does it matter? Or doesn't it to you? It may not. And that's okay too. But it matters to me because it's the difference between blind faith and knowing faith. And I want to be as close to knowing faith at the level that I can, because blind faith to me is what's created some of the most disruption in the conscious expansion in the human race. I mean, I can remember at 13 when they said, well, you just need to believe that because it's so. No, that's not good enough. So what we want to do is capture the best that we can of the greatest parts of our scientific community And not in blind faith, but in knowing faith, and say, this is where they are, but also understand that we have to fill in some gaps. Because they have not gotten there yet. The Taoists call it Wu Qi. It's the one single power present everywhere and has no opposites. It's pure. It's the pure void that everything comes out of. Jesus said, yes, I and my Father are one. His understanding of Father was this divine energy, this divine wisdom, this divine power that was within him. You have to decide what fits your model, because everything hangs off of those questions for you and for me. So in New Thought and Unity, we have 3 words that we use. Omnipresent, which means we're this source, this creative principle of the universe is present everywhere. In every atom, in every cell. It doesn't matter if it's a wave, it doesn't matter if it's a particle, it doesn't matter if it's a string. If your base belief is that this power, this creative principle is present everywhere in you and everything else, it begins to change the way you see the world. Because you begin to fill in the missing 2 questions. The next word that we use is omnipotent. One power, present everywhere. I have no idea. I mean, when I look at, and I'm perfectly fine with the Big Bang Theory, 13.8 billion years ago. I mean, that is so long for me just to think about, but the intelligence that was behind whatever that divine substance was that exploded that many billion years ago, something had to be there to have the raw material and the intelligence to have this become what it is today. I don't see that as random or chance. And finally, omniscience is all wisdom, all knowing. See, the only way that I can answer those 2 questions is knowing that whatever word you use, source, divine, God, spirit, Brahman, the Tao, but these 3 things make up the nature of that center, and it's the only way that I can answer those 2 questions. And once I have that answer, then I can build on the theories of what coalesced together, what occurred later on. But without those 2 questions, you have gaps between the big stuff and the little stuff, and the stuff 13.8 billion years ago and what's happening today. I don't know any other way to do that. And finally, we hear in Genesis, at the very end of that, it said this: that creative principle of the universe looked out at everything that was being created and said, not only is it good, it's very good. So when that's where we get in unity that God is only good. And it's that one power, that one presence, everywhere present, but only good. And it's the humanness that brings the opposite, which is totally in line with all 4 avatars that we've studied. Shankara, Buddha, Krishna, and Lao Tzu. All 4 taught the very same thing over all those centuries. That is taught by our co-founders in Unity. There's a part in this book about where Einstein met with Tagore, who was the Indian philosopher, spiritual man, and came to his home outside of Berlin, and they had this incredible conversation, which if you missed it, go back and read it. It's really interesting when you have a spiritual philosopher talking with a scientist. But Tagore says this: everything comes to us that belongs to us if we create the capacity to receive it. That's our job, is to open to receive all of it. Scientists will work for the next centuries on more definitions and getting down smaller and smaller and bigger. But there has to be some, in my opinion, there has to be some intelligence, because I don't believe in randomness and chance, where the choices are made as we create the life. So how do we live this truth out? Number one is we have to recognize, accept it in our minds. Step one. That's the human part of the rational mind. Is it true for you that the creative principle of the universe is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient? Only you can decide that. But we just start that process in our minds, and then it works down into our hearts, into our feelings and our emotions, where we begin to plug that in and say, yeah, I see that fits with my belief system, and that's what grows the confidence, which is called faith. Or do you say, yeah, this is my affirmation, but inside I'm been fearful of another power? Then it completely wipes it out. So it's through that constant repetition that we go from the mind into the heart and finally into the subconscious and the soul. And it becomes our consciousness. It becomes our belief. And we live from consciousness and belief. And that's the process as we begin to fill in the empty questions that still exist. And I can, for me personally, that's the joy that I find in unity and the principles, is having some answers to fill in what's still being asked. Let's go to stillness. As we take a couple deep breaths, and as we relax into the divine within each and every one of us, that core God center, where the omnipotent, the one power lies, and the wisdom of the universe lies. And it's present in each and every one of our cells. As we breathe in the air with the oxygen in our lungs and keep our bodies working perfectly, in whatever way works for you, to embrace that, to acknowledge it, recognize it, so you can realize the peace and the love and joy comes from that knowing. And in the stillness today, we say yes to that. And so it is.